Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. We hope you are doing well and are staying safe. On behalf of AIOUG, I would like to welcome you today to the next session in our ongoing series of webinars on maximum availability architecture. As you know, at AIOUG, we aim to provide a platform for like-minded professionals to network, share, grow, and interact. It gives Oracle users like us an opportunity to discuss and keep in step with the latest trends and enhancements in the database world. In the effort to keep alive this tradition in these trying times, we've been conducting weekly webinars regularly over the past year. And this month, we have a series of topics, all focused on the maximum availability architecture. Hopefully, this will help you to upskill and learn everything there is about MAA. Okay. Sorry for that. So as I was talking about, I would also like to take a minute and thank all of the speakers from the bottom of my heart for sparing their time. I mean, you can see the list of speakers that we have coming over here for this month. And to all our participants, I strongly urge you to listen carefully and absorb what Ludovico is saying and ask all your questions. This is a golden opportunity where we have people building these products amongst us. So if you've got any questions, any suggestions, perhaps something, an enhancement or a feature that's bugging you, or you think it can improve on the product, this is the perfect forum. Raise your questions, raise your doubts. So also a big thank you to Anil, Sebastian, and Suraj, who would be joining us to answer all your questions and helping Ludovico with the Q&A. So before I introduce our speaker, just going through the few housekeeping standard announcements. Please use the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen for all your questions. If you want any support, you need anything from help, anything from us, you can use the chat box for any questions. And again, as I was mentioning, you can use Twitter to continue this conversation. Ask, even perhaps tomorrow you think of something, anything you want to ask Ludovico, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer you or discuss it with you over Twitter. So reach out to Ludo over Twitter and continue the conversation over there. About the presentation material, it will be accessible from the AIOUG website. After the webinar has completed, give us a day or two to upload it. And if you've got any feedback, any similar topics that you want us to arrange the webinars for, any feedback as such, you can join us on the Telegram channel or send across an email. You can see the details. So now I would like to welcome Ludovico Caldara, who is the Principal Product Manager in High Availability, Scalability, and Maximum Availability Architecture Oracle. Ludovico is a former Oracle Age director who is widely regarded for his contributions in the Oracle community. And I'm sure you've come across his blog, the DBA Survival blog, and it covers a lot of high availability topics. I'm sure it has helped you out, or you've heard him in multitude of conferences across the globe. At Oracle, Ludovico's team focuses on core technologies for mission-critical databases like RAC, DataGuard, ASM, ACFS, ClusterWare, fleet patching, EBR, flashback, etc. His main focus as a product manager are FPP and the online organization. That's your DBMS redef. But he's got experience on a broader set of database products that come in handy when problems or questions are not related to a single technology. So with that, I would like to extend a really warm welcome to Ludovico. And could you kindly share your screen and begin the presentation?
Yes. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much for the warm introduction, and thank you to all the people behind AIOUG for organizing those webinars. Those are really meaningful to us. And thank you everybody for attending. So I'm a principal product manager for patching and provisioning, and you might ask first, how does a product that is about database lifecycle fit into the MAA picture, so the maximum availability architecture. So I will not explain again what maximum availability architecture is, because I think that in this webinar series, you will get used a lot to the slides. But when we take the best practices and recommendation, as I said, for all those products that we have in the MAA portfolio, we combine it into those reference architecture. And fleet patching and provisioning could, of course, manage all the databases from single instance to real application cluster, but especially with real application cluster. So in the Silver architecture, we introduce the zero downtime planned maintenance, because we have a real application cluster with multiple instances, and it's easy to operate some changes, patches, and bounce and change parameters, for example, bounce the instances without any application downtime. But if you have many databases, if you have many real application cluster databases, having a proper orchestration of these operations, relocating the services, stopping the instance, moving the instance of the new patched Oracle home, restarting everything, and do it in a rolling fashion without doing any errors, it's very difficult. That's why FPP is a product that has been developed exactly to resolve this problem of taking complex operations that require a lot of planning and a lot of thinking about the correct order, and package everything into a single product that can orchestrate everything. So we have created this product, FPP, fleet patching and provisioning, that can, from a central server, orchestrate operation on a large amount of target nodes and target databases. It doesn't matter the version, it doesn't matter the type of databases. It's particularly good when it comes to real application cluster databases, and when it comes to do mass operation on a big amount of nodes. So we have customers, for example, that can patch several thousands of databases per weekend. So those are, for me, quite good numbers if I compare with my previous DBA experience, where we used to do just a few per weekend, probably. We recommend FPP on a Linux system, but the targets can be Linux, Solaris, and AIX. So you can see that we do not support all the supported database platform. We don't have HPUX here, and we don't have Windows. But we do support all the version from 11.204, that is in extended version now, in extended support, up to the 21C that has been released, what was that, 1 or 2 days ago? And of course, CDBs, PDBs. So FPP supports a big amount of different environments, and you can imagine that having that many different environments, it's very difficult to automate, and that's why we put a lot of effort in finding all the corner cases, all the possible configuration, different configuration like uniform users, or separation of duties, or different Oracle users per Oracle home, per database. We support all those different configuration with different types of databases. So rack, single instance, with ASM or on-file system. Those are a big amount of possible combination that are not easy to automate if you want to do this in-house. So this presentation will be quite particular for me, because I'm very used to showcase all the different features of FPP, but because I've heard that you are very technical audience in India and you like technical details, I decided why not having just an overview of the feature and then go a little bit deeper in the technical details of the architecture and internal FPP. So I will give you just a few features that can be that you can find in FPP, and then try to give you some more technical detail about the server architecture. So FPP can, let's say, manage databases in their whole life cycle. So that comes from creating the Oracle homes, installing clusters, creating databases, patching databases, moving them from a non-patched Oracle home to a patched Oracle home. This is something that you need to know, that FPP never does in-place patching. So it never stop an instance, patch the binary and start the instance. But what it does is always install a new Oracle home, patch it beside the current one, and move the database from the previous Oracle home to the new Oracle home, and just run data patch on top of it. So it's always out of place patching. And what we can do with FPP is move them, and especially if we have real application cluster, we can have patching operation without downtime, and FPP will take care of all the complex steps that you will normally do. For example, if you have two instances in a real application cluster, you have a few services on one node, a few services on the other node. What FPP will do will take the services from one node and relocate them by honoring the service drain timeout that has been specified service by service. Or we can also specify our own service timeout when we run the command. So all the services will be relocated, and then the instance will be stopped. The configuration files will be copied from one Oracle home to the other one. And the Oracle, the database as well will be run on the new Oracle home. And then it will relocate the services back and do the same for all the remaining instances. It doesn't matter if it's a 2-node cluster, if it's a 12-node cluster, FPP orchestrate everything in a way that is recommended by the MAA best practices, so that if your application is properly configured with connection pools using session draining or application continuity, your application will not experience any downtime during the patching process. So this is the main benefit of lead patching and provisioning, and of course having this capability of doing it in parallel on several nodes. We have, for example, customers that have completely automated the patching of all their databases, and by combining application continuity and session draining on top of them, they can patch during office hours. So they don't even need to patch during the weekend anymore, because they already know when they have low, I would say, low rate transactions. So low transaction rate, so they can patch without impacting the application. FPP can also upgrade the databases, provision cluster. They can patch the cluster always out of place using a new grid infrastructure Oracle home, patch and upgrade the cluster. So FPP can also upgrade your cluster from a 12.2, for example, to 19C, or from 19C to 12.1. Everything is automated by FPP. So those are the main features. There are many other features that you can use. For example, a custom user action that allow you to specify your workflow for specific operations. For example, when you create a new database, you might want to add it as a target in Enterprise Manager, or you might want it to add it as in the Arman catalog, register it with the Arman catalog. You can define your own actions, and you can register your script so that it can be executed before or after you create or patch specific databases. So we have many customers that complain about the fact that we used to have, and we still have, a lot of tools in order to manage the database lifecycle. So you might know all of those tools already. This is what you would use when you try to patch your databases manually or install new software. And FPP position itself exactly as a single entry point. So it does not replace any of those tools. It just automates the execution of those tools so that you don't have to. So the good part of it is that you have a single point where you can enter a command and it orchestrates all the operations. The bad part of this is that if you have any underlying problem, for example, if you have a wrong metadata in your database, a wrong dictionary, for example, or if you have an underlying problem in your cluster setup, FPP is not able to solve them. Any errors that you would encounter manually by doing everything the correct way, if you encounter any problems manually, you will encounter them also using fleet patching and provisioning. Because FPP automates, but doesn't do any different than what you would do manually. Okay. And here I put OPatch and OPatch Auto in red and gray. Basically, FPP never use OPatch and OPatch Auto because, as I said, it does not do in-place patching. It always do out-of-place patching, meaning that it's never patching an Oracle home itself, but it always prepare a new Oracle home aside. Okay. And it's up to you to provide FPP with the good binaries. So you prepared your gold image, you import your gold image into FPP, and FPP will use that as a new Oracle home on the targets. So it doesn't use OPatch and OPatch Auto. But it does use, for example, DataPatch, because when it moves a database to the new Oracle home, it will use DataPatch. Or it will use servctl to create or relocate the services, for example, DBCA to create the databases, DBUA in silent mode to upgrade your database, and started with 21C, and this is something that we plan to backport also in NTC. You can also use the auto-upgrade tool as a backend for the upgrades, because we have many customers that when discovered auto-upgrade, and I include myself, I was still a customer when auto-upgrade came out. They love auto-upgrade, and it asked to integrate auto-upgrade with FPP, and now you have the choice with 21C and soon with NTC to use auto-upgrade as a backend for your database upgrades. Of course, the upgrade, all the operations in FPP are quite easy to achieve. The upgrade is the only operation that requires a lot of planning, because you need to take care of your client drivers, your application itself must be tested properly with the new version, and all the checks and the fix-ups that you will do manually, you still have to do them before running the actual upgrade with FPP. So it's a little bit more complex doing upgrades compared to other features. So about FPP architecture, as I said, FPP is a central server that operates on different targets. The central server itself must be a full grid infrastructure stack. That means that FPP must be installed on a cluster. It can also be a single node with a full grid infrastructure stack. We recommend having multiple nodes, possibly 2, if you want more, but 2 is more than enough to provide high availability. But why we need the grid infrastructure stack? First is for the high availability of the service, and second, because FPP relies on a few grid infrastructure technologies in order to provide the services. So when you install your grid infrastructure stack, you have to configure it with the management database, the grid infrastructure management repository. Okay. With 19C, this is not mandatory by default. You have to configure the management database explicitly when you configure the cluster, otherwise you can do it later. With 21C, there is a news that I would say it's better for some ways, but for the FPP itself, it's perhaps not the best option. But 21C requires to have a separate database home for the management database. So when you set up the FPP with 21C, you have to set up grid infrastructure, create a new Oracle home, database Oracle home specific for the management database, and create management database with that Oracle home. So it's an additional step to configure it, but it's nothing overly complex. So in the normal cluster configuration, you will have all those components, okay? And if you configure the management database, you will also have this local rapid provisioning server, so an FPP server, but it's a local one that can do just a couple of operations, patching the cluster and patching the databases. It does not manage Oracle homes, or it cannot do upgrades or things like that. So what you have to do in order to configure the full server is to remove this local version of Rapid Provisioning Server, RHP Server, and you have to configure a GNS and start the server by specifying a disk group. The disk group will contain the ACFS file system that are used by FPP to store the images and to store some data. and then you can start the server. So those are all the components that are configured with RHP Server. Sorry, when I say RHP and FPP, actually it's the same thing. The problem is that Rapid Home Provisioning was the old name before 18C. Then with 18C, it has been renamed to Fleet Patching and Provisioning. So FPP and RHP are actually the same thing. It's just a different, a new name. But the commands and in the logs, the components still have RHP. That's why I say RHP instead of FPP sometimes. Please forget me, but this is some confusion due to the change of the name. But actually, the full name now is Fleet Patching and Provisioning, but we still call it RHP when we refer to the internal components. And then you can start importing the images. Okay, so the images are your golden copies that you want to store in the FPP server, and from the FPP server, you can redistribute them on all the targets. So let's have a look at the single components. The GNS is a DNS server, so you might already know that if you are familiar with the advanced clusterware functionalities. And it is used by the clients when they need to know on which node is actually running the RHP server. They do a quick DNS call to the GNS server, and the GNS server will answer the IP of the actual server, so that there can be a connection. Because we didn't want to introduce a virtual IP specifically for RHP server, and decided to use the GNS just to point you to the correct server. The RHP server itself is a Java servlet container. More specifically is a Tomcat container. Today, we plan to change it in the future, but it's still a Tomcat in 19C and 21C. That by default listen only on the JM export, but you can configure it also on the HTTPS port if you want to leverage REST API calls. So RHP, FPP, you can run it using the RHP CTL command line, or you can also send REST calls and have the same behavior by using JSON payloads and JSON answers from the RHP server. I will discuss about the helper itself, but just to let you know that it is a process that automates a few small tasks. And the metadata repository is used for storing the FPP metadata. So there you have a few tables that contain some details about the images, the working copies, the audit entries that you can use to see all the commands that have been run in FPP, for example. Then we have a checkpoint file system. The checkpoint file system is used by FPP to write checkpoints after each operation, because all the operation that you do in FPP, you can retry them. So if they fail at any point, you can find the root cause, fix the problem, and rerun the very same command. FPP will run from the point where it failed. And this point is stored inside ACFS file system that is called the checkpoint file system. Okay. And then we have a mount point that will contain all the ACFS images. We will have one ACFS image, one ACFS file system per code image. So when you configure everything properly, you will have this. This is the empty RHP server, where you have in orange all the additional components that are configured because we have configured the RHP server on top of it. So we have, as local resource, we have the file system, we have the helper, we have the volume manager, the volume, ADVM volume. We have the GNS, the management database, and RHP server and listener. This is what it looks like when you have an empty FPP server running. And you can get the configuration at any time. So you can see that this part of the clusterware configuration is a clusterware resource. Now, discussing about this RHP helper, what it's about really. The RHP helper is used by FPP to execute specific unit of works. So because FPP does all the operation remotely, and sometimes in specific cases that we will see, it has to execute the command via SSH. It's not practical to execute all the round trips for all the small tasks. Okay, so there is this RHP helper. There is a wrapper that points to different libraries. We have one library per version. So depending on the target version, FPP will take the library, copy this library to the target, and ask this library to execute a specific unit of work. The unit of work might be stop the instances, relocate the services, start the instances, give me the information about the databases, what are the database names, unique names, Oracle homes, information like that. So that those units of work are encapsulated and executed, and those are atomic and always consistent because they're always the same for that specific version. And then FPP in the Java container logic contains all the different unit of work that must be executed in a specific order so that your operations are always successful. Now, there are two types of targets. We have the targets that do not have any client counterpart process. And we have the targets that have a counterpart process on the client that also has some intelligence on the client. So we make the distinction between the targets that do not have this component that is called RHP client and the targets that have it. The targets that do not have it are all the single instances, all the Oracle restart environments, and all the old grid infrastructure installation, and by all the, I mean 12.1. Because as soon as you have a grid infrastructure 12.2 or later, you have to configure this component. And this component is useful because you have an RHPCTL command line on the client that you can use, for example, to start the commands from the client itself instead of starting it from the server. Sometimes it might be useful, even if I would recommend to always do it from the server. And also, you don't need to specify any SSH credential anymore because you will have two processes that will have their keepers to communicate each other without any additional authentication, because they have an embedded handshaking at the beginning when you add the client, and then everything will be automated. But it's just to let you know that you connect to the two targets in a different way. The normal targets by SSH, the others, it will use a JMX for the connection. So the normal target, as I said, SSH, that means that we have to provide credentials. And credential could be a root, could be a pseudo user. And the pseudo user must have pseudo root privileges. Why? Because in the lifecycle of a database, we need to create and delete Oracle homes. And in order to create the Oracle homes, we need to create the mount point that might be in existence. So we might need to write in the root file system. We have to run root.sh or ora-inst-root.sh in order to create a central inventory, in order to set the set UID bits for Oracle, for the ASM binaries. There are several reasons. Also, if you have role separation, some operation should be done as grid, some other operations are as Oracle. So in that case, you also need the possibility to be root and become those users at any time. You can store the credential. In that case, the credential will go in a wallet that is inside the Oracle cluster registry of the server. The transfer itself is not done by SSH, but it's done through racktrans. That is a small binary that we copy from the server to the target. And there, racktrans will open a few ports. The FPP can use in parallel to push in parallel all the files. So this makes the copy process fast, even without zipping the Oracle home itself, because the zipping process will add time and will also add CPU load on the server and the target to do the compression and uncompression. The clients are basically targets where we have grid infrastructure, and we can configure this additional process. So on the client clusterware, you will see the RHP client as another clusterware resource. And it is the same as the RHP server. It's basically a serverless container that contains some logic. When you have this, this client, as I said, it works with JMX with TLS encryption. Okay, so you don't need any SSH root user or sudo user, because all the operations are done by this Java container that runs with sudo permissions. So basically the RHP server will ask the RHP client to do the operation, and it will have root permission to do all the necessary tasks. So this is somehow a better approach instead of having sudo users and sudo credential stored somewhere. It's just that the client will be a cluster resource that can do everything. We add the clients by creating a manifest file from the server for that specific client. So it will create SSH key pairs for the client in order to connect to the server. Okay, so you can take this manifest file, copy it by any secure mean, that can be SCP or USB stick or whatever you want. You copy in a way that you trust this manifest file to the client, and then you use this manifest file to add the client. This will basically create the resource, establish the secure connection using JMX and TLS keys with the server. Then you can start the client, and if you can query the server from the client and you get the server details, that means that all the ports are open and the connection is successful. So those key pairs are stored in the OCRs, in the cluster registries of the server and the client. Okay, the server will have one key pair for each client that you manage. The client will have its own key pair to connect securely to the server. And you cannot exchange those keys. You cannot just take a key pair from one client and copy it on another client, because that will not work. The FPP expects to have a specific key pair from a specific client. So you cannot spoof this communication, and it's quite secure by design. Now, when you have the setup of the server and the clients, you want starting using the images and copy those images to the targets. You can copy them using zip files, or you can copy the image from existing Oracle homes, either a local Oracle home or a remote Oracle home. The recommendation is that you get an Oracle home that is clean. So imagine that you want to have a new image for 1912. The recommendation is that you install a 19.3, apply 1912, and import that image, so that you don't have any problem with configuration files with leftovers in the Oracle home. So FPP by default take an Oracle home and does all the cleanup as we have documented in our documentation. So removing all the trace files, SP files, etc. But you never know. Someone in your company might have done some changes that you're not aware of. And that's why we always recommend to start with a clean Oracle home. So this other add image, I will explain it later, but it's related to having the Oracle homes installed on ACFS on the target. So it's a little bit more complex, but what allows is to have incremental snapshots. Instead of importing a full image, it can just import only the differences between two versions. And I will explain it in more detail later. And this is what I get when I import the images, okay? So for example, if I want to import an image of my grid infrastructure that is running, my very own grid infrastructure that is running on the FPP server, I could just import the image, specify an image name, specify the software type, because by default it's supposed a GP or Home. And as you can see, it creates an ACFS file system, copy the contents, does some checks and cleanups, and then it registers as a valid golden image. And the same for the database, okay? So you can query the image afterwards and get all the details. Those details, it can take a few of those details from the metadata repository. The most important are, of course, the size, the version. What I think is also, well, really important is the patches that are contained in this gold image, but also the groups, okay? Because by default, when I try to deploy this image to the targets, it will try to use the very same groups that it found when imported the image. So if I want to use any different groups, when I will add the working copy, I will need to specify explicitly the new users, the new administrative groups. And this is an example of a query. So I have the query, of an image. I can query the image, and I can see that I have an ACFS file system for it. And I can get the snapshot details for that file system, and I can see that it's made read-only, so that no one can connect to the FPP server and try to tamper the content of the Home, because it's read-only. So it's not possible to modify it by definition. And we have those details stored in the metadata repository, okay? So the metadata repository is a CDB that contains a PDB, which name is usually GIMR_DSC_rect_10. I don't know why we have this name, but it's always the same. And inside this PDB, you will have a schema that will contain the FPP metadata. And the name is GHS user 19 for 19, will be 21 for 21. And you have a list of tables that are quite interesting for your curiosity, but we do not support queries, and we do not support, of course, modification to those tables. So the reason why we do not support queries is that at any time we might change the shape of the tables. We do not commit of having a specific layout of the tables. That does not mean that you cannot. If you find it useful in your environment, you can. But if you have any problems with it, that your query does not work suddenly, or the metadata that you find is not 100% correct, well, we do not support the content of those tables, because you should do everything from the RHP command line. But this is the architecture and internal presentation, so I think that it's nice to know that you have this information there. Now, when I take the working copies and I copy them, I can copy them with two types of storage. The first one is the local storage, and the second one is the ACFS storage. So the local storage means that you have the control of the file system. The file system must be there, must be big enough. And what FPP will do is basically just copy the gold image to the specified path that you specified, and clone the Home so that it registers it inside the central inventory, so that it will be ready for usage. And the transfer, as I say, is done via rack trans. This rack trans that is valid for both local ACFS targets with or without client. It's done via rack trans, and by default, this rack trans is done using an ephemeral ports. So the ephemeral ports are all the ports that are above 32,000 and something. So you have to open the ephemeral ports for your communication. If you cannot, you can still specify a port range, fixed one, that will be used. So basically FPP will copy rack trans, and when it executes rack trans to start the transfer, those ports will be open, and the server will establish the communication and send all the files through those ports. And you can see the port listening, and you can see the socket established. while the transfer is happening. When the transfer is over, RACTrans will just stop and the ports will be released for the next operation. Okay. And this is what you get. At the end, you will see, this is the command that I can run, for example, add the working copy, I specify the image name, storage type local, I can specify the user, whatever I want. The working copy name that must be unique in your environment, and the path. So in this case, local, I can specify the path, and I can see in the central inventory that the Oracle Home is registered with the same name as the working copy name that I've specified. Okay, so this is important information in case you are used to look at the content of the central inventory, so you can match which working copy is corresponding to which target without querying necessarily the RHP server. And this is a full example. So of output. Of course, I had to truncate the output, but basically it starts the connection, it checks start the remote copy, it clones, and you still have this funny warning that says that clone.pl is deprecated. So we have many customers complaining about this warning, but deprecated doesn't mean unsupported. That means that if you use it at some point, it might disappear, but it's still there, and FPP still use it because it still works. So it's not really an error. And you can see that then it starts the universal installer, and it asks to run root.sh that you don't need to run because FPP will also run it for you. And at the end, we'll have the working copy created correctly. So this was the local one. The ACFS one is very similar, except that you don't need to provision a file system. But when you create your RHP client, you also specify the AESM disk group that you want to use for your ACFS file system. And what FPP will do, it will create an ACFS file system for your working copy. It will copy the image to the base ACFS file system, but this will not be the Oracle Home because it will also create a read-write snapshot on top of it, and the read-write snapshot on top of it will be the actual Oracle Home. And this is important because the base file system will contain the gold image that does not change. What change is only the snapshot, and this is what allows you to have the incremental copies from the client back to the server in order to have new version of images that are incremental and space efficient. And I think I have an example later. But this means that this is what you get as an Oracle Home. So you cannot specify the path anymore because it takes the mount point that you have specified when you have created the client. And you will have the name of the image, .acfs, so this is a hidden file system, snaps, working copy name, software home. So this is your final Oracle Home. And I know that it's ugly to see, but yeah, that's that's how it is. And I can see, again, on the client, this time I can see that I have a snapshot. Sorry, an ACFS file system and a read-write snapshot that is my actual Oracle Home. So that allows to do this kind of workflow. You can have, for example, you start with here with the 1911 gold image. You can deploy this 1911 image as a working copy on a client, and you will have this snapshot as Oracle Home. Now, if you patch in place yourself with patch apply and you patch to 1912, you see that this is a read-write snapshot, and all the differences from 1912 and 1911 are contained in this snapshot. So what you can do later is you can RHPCTL add image of a new image, but because FPP will know that this working copy was based on a 1911, it will just take the delta and store the 1912 code image as a delta from 1911. So if you are really under space pressure, this might be a good solution. I do not recommend it because you have dependencies between snapshots. And when you want to backup, you cannot just back up a portion. It's a little bit complex when it comes to backing up the ACFS file system that contains snapshots. So I really recommend that you use the normal import that import the full the full copy of the gold image inside your server. We also have, well, as I said, I will not explain all the feature about database upgrades. I just explained you at the beginning what the different features are. What is important to know is also how FPP can deal with Exadata software patching, because of course FPP can provision grid infrastructure and databases inside Exadata, but it can also patch the Exadata software for network switches, database nodes, and storage cells. Okay, if you want to do that, I recommend to use the 1912 because we have a few fixes for that. But how does it work? And this is the important part to let you understand if you have any Exadata, how you can patch with FPP. Basically, you have your Exadata image that you download, and you have to import that Exadata image inside FPP, like if it was a normal image. You just have to flag it as Exapatch software image type. Then when you want to update an Exadata software, for example, in this case, it's DB nodes, you have to deploy the image to your target. It will deploy it to your DOM0 or DOM-U, depending on your deployment type. And it will unzip the image that will contain your ISO zip for your component, for example, your DOM-U or your storage cells, and it will contain a patch manager. Okay, so you can, in the next step, say that you want to update the components, pass your ISO bundle, so your zip file, and your patch manager location. And you can pass all the arguments that you will pass to patch manager. So all those parameters are the parameters that are recommended to be used with patch manager to correctly patch DB nodes, InfiniBand switches, or storage cells. So the same steps, you can do them from FPP. So it doesn't change much, but you don't have the burden of taking the images, copy them to all your Exadata fleet, unzip it, and run one by one on the different servers. You can do everything centrally from FPP. Okay, but the concept of patch manager is still valid and it's still there in Exadata. Now, how much time do I have? I think we are at 47 minutes. Is it correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So just about troubleshooting, because we've seen that FPP centralizes everything, but has a huge amount of possible components, that there are many points of failure actually. So if you have any error, you should try to understand if it's an error coming from FPP itself. That might be, I don't know, an FPP bug, for example, or it can be an error coming from other components. That can be a network issue, it can be insufficient space, permission problems, clusterware problems, underlying problems that you don't see, but perhaps the clusterware is not healthy, or database problems. Okay, so you have to understand what's the problem, and if you have to open service request, I recommend that you open the service request in the category of the underlying issue, because if you open all the issues as FPP and the problem is perhaps a data patch problem, it will take a while to be redirected properly. So we all know that support is not always super reactive. Sorry to say that, but that's the reality. So if you don't want to add additional delay, try to figure out what's the component that is failing and try to open the correct category for a service request. So in case it's a networking problem, we have in the documentation a table that explains which ports must be open in which condition. So if you have a target with client, a target without client, or if you're doing server peering, so if you're putting two FPP server in communication, what I suggested is that you do all the network checkup and see if all the ports are open. So you can get the ports configured with config RHP server and use Netcat or whatever other tool you like to to check the open ports. And also check latency and bandwidth, okay, because there are a lot of files transferred, and if you have big latencies between the server and the target that might not work properly, you can have timeouts. If you have problem, for example, starting the FPP server, you should check basically if all the components are up, and especially check if your ACFS driver is loaded, because we have seen that ACFS is a central key component in FPP server. So if you, for example, if you install the latest version of Oracle Linux 8, and you do not have the latest version of the release update of 19C, that will not work because you don't have the driver that is compatible with the latest kernel. So this is the normal troubleshooting that you will do. And of course, it's part of clusterware, so the clusterware troubleshooting applies. But then if you have problem with the server, we have a server log that is quite big. And as I explained before, all the operations are done by copying the RHP helper and running the work of unit of work on the targets. Okay, so you will have log files of those operations on the clients, and that means that if any of the operation fails on the client, you should go to the client and find the trace file and find the information there of the root cause, because sometimes FPP is able to give you the root cause in the standard output. Sometimes it's not possible because the operations are quite complex. And of course, if you have a problem with clusterware and database, the normal troubleshooting applies. So TFA collection, alert log, trace files, data patch log, auto upgrade logs, depending on what is failing, you can find the logs in the usual log directory of the tool. Okay, so if it's a DBCA log, you will have the config tool logs somewhere. You should find that. So what I recommend as a basic approach for troubleshooting, use the query audit to find the time frame where you had the failure, and then go in the big log. Sadly, the RHP CTL log, sorry, the RHP server log is a big log with all the operation inside. Try to find the base operation and find the unique identifier of that operation. And then it's easy to just grab this identifier and isolate the log for that specific operation. So depending on what failed, if it's an operation on the target, you can just find what was the trace file used by the helper, go on the client, find this file, and there find, try to find the root cause. That might be in another log file, for example, an auto upgrade file. But this is the approach for troubleshooting. So if you want to have more information, especially about the feature, because we have not discussed many features here, you can go to the Rapid Provisioning landing page. There we have documentation, we have slide decks, we have videos. The documentation itself, we have a separate book for that. So if you Google FPP 19C documentation, there are high possibilities that you will be redirected to the clusterware documentation, because at the beginning, the documentation was there and it's still there, but the paragraph is old. You should really try to find the FPP book, and you can see that you have FPP AD as a book ID. This is what you want to use. It contains much more information also about extra data updates. The structure is more easy to go through. And if you want to try it, we have the Vagrant project on GitHub, where you can spin up VirtualBox or KVM virtual environments to try it on your KVM or VirtualBox environment. Or you can use the Live Labs. So we will talk about Live Labs here at the AIUG in the MAA series next week. And we will explain what Live Labs are and how you can use them for FPP and for other MAA products. And then I think it's all for this architecture and internal session. I'm open for questions for the next, sorry, 5 minutes, a little bit over time. So no, let me check. Okay, so we answered 15 questions. Thank you, Suraj and Sebastian, for that. So we have one more open question. If my RHP server on Linux, can I create images for homes for Solaris and AIX? So the answer is yes, but those images, you should create them on a Solaris or AIX box. So you have your Linux server, you have your Solaris and AIX boxes. You can install your Oracle homes on the Solaris and AIX boxes and import those homes from the Linux FPP server. So this is supported. But if you have a different architecture, like described in the question, you cannot import a zip file, because before importing the Oracle home on a different platform, FPP will make sure that the Oracle home is healthy. Okay. This is something that it can do only if the Oracle home is attached in and installed properly. Okay.
Ludovico, there was
yes.
one other question which we put in the backlog, which essentially was, as of today, RHP Helper itself does essentially also does not have an option to exclude SQLnet Aura, TNS names Aura, and the patch storage directory. So it looks like SQLnet and TSN names Aura are getting merged, so which might pose a problem. So it would really be good to be able to exclude them. And the other problem is with the with the patch storage folder, which you essentially retrieve when you do a lot of in-place patching to create your DB home. That this gets quite big to be replicated, which is actually not used for replicating. So I'm surprised that we replicate this as well.
Yes, so this is a very current and actual discussion with the development, because we want to get rid of patch storage, because we know that if we deploy an Oracle home, we don't need to roll back anything anymore because we have the previous code image. But basically, we want to be extra careful and be sure with the team that develop the patches for the database, that it's 100% safe to delete it. Because when I was DBA, I remember that I used it to delete the patch storage just to free up some space, because I was using out of place patching as well. But we want to be 100% sure that it will not have any side effect before removing patch storage using FPP. And for the merge of the .aura files, yes, this is a good question. We don't have any way to change this now. So either you integrate your custom script to save and restore those files, or if you write me an email, I would be happy to get your input about it and see if we can put an announcement request to change this behavior.
There is no way to delete it from the gold image that if it is empty in merge case?
So that's one of the reasons why we recommend to have an empty Oracle home, because you won't have to deal with this.
Oh, okay.
Then what do we have? Do we have the capability of performing prerequisite while deploying new home target like missing RPMs? So yes, so we have the capability of checking the pre-requirements. Basically, this is when you try to install an Oracle home, if there are any requirement missing, it would just throw an error. And this error is your check, basically. If you don't have any missing requirement, it will just install. Then FPP Server support database from version 11.2, and it used different helper version. Yes, but the OS requirement for FPP target are the same as FPP Server. we cannot use FPP Server with FPP target. Running Oracle DB. Okay, so this might be a compatibility matrix problem. So the OS requirement of target and server are not necessarily the same. You can have a server on Red Hat 7 and a target on Red Hat 6. So I don't get the question, perhaps. So I don't get the question.
To make
100%.
the question short, Ludovico, the question is essentially that your FPP target can be at a lower version than the FPP server.
Absolutely, yes. So you can have an FPP server that is 19C on Oracle Linux 8, and then you can have a target that is 12.1 on Oracle Linux 6, for example.
And there is no requirement to relink the DB home because of the different Linux version. Because I mean, FPP is just copying the database home over. There
is a link done by default when not in a working copy.
Then it should really not matter. So.
That should not matter. If it's not the case, just ping me, and this is something that we have to see, but it should be the case. And then how do you manage hard-coded Oracle Home in scripts? Well, do not hard-code the Oracle Home in scripts. This is my best recommendation. You should always get the Oracle Home dynamically, either from OraTab or from the clusterware configuration. This is the only way that you can ensure that you don't have to change all your management scripts.
Does FPP have a capability to an in-place Oracle Home patching? Because I mean, thinking of our e-business suite, which do not allow changing the Oracle Home. I do know that on XSES, we had a lot of effort in getting an in-place, out-of-place home patching to not change the DB home. The same capability does not exist in FPP today, does it?
No. So FPP is only out of place. There is an experimental feature that is not bulletproof, and I do not recommend it, that use some new file system capabilities in Linux to have a, well, it's hard to explain now. I'm not prepared for that. It would be possible using this experimental feature to keep the very same Oracle Home path, but it's as I said, it's experimental, and we do not recommend it now. So consider that it's always out of place, and that Oracle Home will always change. Yeah. And the links on additional info. Yes, basically, if you go to oracle.com/go/FPP, you go to the FPP landing page, and there you can find all the slides, all the documentation. Not this slide deck yet, but I will have it uploaded to the AIUUG website very soon. And I will also upload this slide deck on the landing page so that you will find it also on the FPP landing page. And yeah, no more questions. So thank you very much for the attention.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ludovico. Thank you so much, Seb and Suraj, for all your help with the questions and answers.
And any question, feel free to contact me directly. So I'm always keen to help for new implementation or answering questions, help you fixing stuff. So don't hesitate. Thank you.
We have one question that just came in. I mean, can we monitor FPP using the OEM?
No. So that is a good question. OEM as at the time being, OEM as a separate product inside OEM for the database lifecycle management that somehow compete with FPP. So which one is best for your scenario depends on you. You should perhaps try both. But if you are on a real application cluster environments or Exadata environment, FPP is definitely the best choice for that. Also because FPP is included in the real application cluster license. Otherwise, for single instance, FPP requires database lifecycle management pack, which is what you can also use for Enterprise Manager. But there is no plugin for Enterprise Manager to monitor FPP because they have their own product for database lifecycle. Yeah. And my mail ID is ludovico.caldara, so my first dot last name @oracle.com.
So you can see the spelling on the slide itself.
Yes, yes, exactly.
And of course, there's a Twitter handle as well if you need any more information or if you have any more questions. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for your time.
Thank you very much for organizing.
Welcome. And before we close, again, here are the upcoming webinars that we have. We've got the next one coming this Friday. That's the Oracle Sideguard, and you can see the other ones that are lined up for next week. There's the live, the live labs that Ludovico was talking about. That's next week. So hopefully you can register and share this information with your colleagues. Thank you very much. I'll be closing the webinar now.